Namaste, my friends, and welcome to The Gathering. I am David Ault. For about the last month and a half, I have been facilitating a virtual sort of book club. I called this book club Quiet on the Inside. And what I wanted to explore was some curated textbooks, inspirations that were fairly classic but widespread by different teachers. And it's been fun to be able to use this material to promote discussion about what it means to uncover a sense of quiet on the inside, particularly in the appearance of a world so noisy. And this past week, we went and began to look at some of the writings of Joel Goldsmith. If you're not familiar with Joel Goldsmith, the biggest notoriety associated with his name would be The Infinite Way, which was a book that he wrote, but also a part of a movement that subscribed to his meditative practices and his spiritual philosophy. Really great stuff. He wrote a book that was a part of our discussion called Practicing the Presence. And the reason why I wanted to revisit this book, this classic about quiet on the inside, was to look at the way in which we hold one another in consciousness. The chapter was, what was the chapter called? It was about love thy neighbor. And so I want to kind of set this up in this way. I remember reading a meme one time, and it said, I had to make you uncomfortable. I had to make you uncomfortable. Otherwise, you would have never moved. I really liked that meme. It was reflective of what I would think if the universe talked to me. It would give me that message, saying I had to make you uncomfortable. In other words, I had to do something to sort of shake the inertia within you, not just physical movement, but mental movement. I had to do something in order to create a disruption in the inertia of thought and identity, particularly when it comes to the other, this idea of the other. So you know what I mean by that? The greatest illusion, spiritually, from a metaphysical perspective, is the us and the them. The way in which we hold the thought that we are separate from other people. Greatest illusion, I believe, but also the greatest lesson. Because when we can begin to become uncomfortable with the concept of the us and them, when the universe, let's say, makes us uncomfortable in order to get us to move into a deeper consideration that there is no us and them, then magic starts to happen. And so I was thinking a lot of, I've been doing live events, and I've started my lessons and my interactions with people with this. I've been a part of a philosophy for decades, and one of the fundamental things that is shared both in teaching and in prayer is the idea that God is all that there is. I want to spend the remainder of my years bringing integrity into that statement. I don't want to just have it be a part of recitation. I want to find out what it means to live that. And so part of living that is an intention. So it's like I am leaning into this intention, which reminds me of the meme that it has to make me uncomfortable in order to move into a greater embodiment of that intention. I have to begin to look at the way in which I don't love my neighbor, or I hold my neighbor in a particular stagnant viewpoint. And so how relevant and how perfect in order to revisit this Joel Goldsmith material on loving thy neighbor. And so I used this as a part of our virtual book club last week, and it was really quite something to go back to material that holds within it a sort of absolutist viewpoint. And by absolutist, I mean there is no varying with regards to saying, here is the principle. Here is the principle that God is all that there is. And then look at the way in which you and I want to deviate from that, the way in which we want to create a special occasion around that, the way in which we want to have some form of wiggle room with the principle. And Goldsmith's like going, the principle is the principle. And so we have to look at the way in which we bring that absolute principle into the relative nature of being human. And what better practice than something about the way in which we view our neighbor? And so he used a phrase that you might be familiar with. It's kind of biblical, but to bear false witness. First of all, let's unpack that phrase a little bit. To bear false witness. What does that actually mean? What does it mean to witness someone? You know, we have so many different variables of that word now. Witness protection program. Can I get a witness? Can I get someone to see me? So this idea of to be a witness is to see someone, to really see someone. And to bear false witness is to see someone falsely. And so, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. A commandment, right? Is to say we have to become aware of the absolute principle and bring that down into the relative of my humanness in order to rise above humanness and see the humanness for what it is, and to become more of the absolute in the framework of this incarnation. And that means then that I must become aware of how much false witness bearing I am engaged in. I know, right? And so I have to go back to my intention, which is help me be the most optimal instrument and example that God is all that there is that I can be. I don't want to just say it. I don't want to just teach it. I don't want to just pray it. I want to live as it, which means that I want to be the most optimized representation of God. And so that means then that part of the practice of that is to not bear false witness. And so Joel Goldsmith says, to bear false witness against our neighbor is to declare that they are human, that they are finite, that they have failings, that they are less than the very child of God. And every time we acknowledge humanhood, we violate cosmic law. Every time we acknowledge someone's humanhood, there are mistakes, there are flaws, there are damage, there are neuroses, there are eccentricities, as if it's something to be negative or to be viewed as negative. We are violating cosmic law. What is the cosmic law? Cosmic law, that absolute. We're violating this principle that God is all that there is. I know it feels like very strong language to say that we're violating it, but in essence, it's okay. If we're going to subscribe to a spiritual philosophy that is built around the idea that all is one, all is God, that we live in a perfect patterning, then how much are we willing to practice that? How much are we willing to look at the way in which we are violating this principle and then begin to make adjustments? And by make adjustments, I mean how much are we willing to relinquish more of our relative nature and allow more of the absolute to come in? You know what? It's not very popular It's not particularly easy to do, particularly when the noise is the noise and it's voluminous and it's everywhere. And it has a bit of a tribalism around it because we can find a tribe to hang out with in the noise. That particular collective and connection with regards to the absolute and living that principle can sometimes feel very isolating and unvalidating, the paradox of it all. It's like, no, I can find other people to agree with me in my smallness rather than in the godness. But it's all about what you want to do, what you want to do with regards to living in integrity with this. So this message is in and of itself is like that meme that I shared with you. I have to make you uncomfortable, or the message has to make you uncomfortable. Otherwise, we may not have ever moved into the purity and the essence of what we are, which is the absolute. The relative is sort of the illusion, and we're in the experience of this relative only to return more and access more of the absolute. I know, it's crazy, right? Why did we incarnate? Why is our soul in this journey? Why did we come from something that was infinite and then come down into something that's finite, only to have that journey move us back into that which is infinite? I don't have a real clear answer on that, but that's exactly what we do. We go from non-dual to dual in hopes that we can remember the non-dual, right? And so we go from being this essence and this vehicle for God into the density of this incarnation that forgets that we are that, only to then open ourselves up in our spiritual journey to remember. And so let's think of today, or let's think of this message as a piece or an ingredient in this cosmic soup that is nourishing us back into remembering. And so when we look at Goldsmith's words, to bear false witness against someone is an actual violation of this cosmic law. Every time, he says, we acknowledge our neighbor as sinful, poor, sick, or dead, every time we acknowledge them other than being this child of God, we are bearing false witness against them. I know it feels like a lot, doesn't it? I know it probably feels like a lot, particularly now when this division seems to be so exacerbated by what we now have as media. And the immediacy of the media, it kind of fuels the division against this very message. He says that in violation of this law, we bring our own punishment. This is really good to think about, because if there is no us and them, like we said earlier, then when I am bearing false witness against my neighbor, what am I doing? I'm bearing false witness against myself. I'm actually bringing the violation against myself. There is no escape of that. And so we can justify all day long about why it's necessary and why it's appropriate and why it's important to bear false witness, to call all of this out. But in essence, every time I am acknowledging, and Goldsmith used this term, every time I am acknowledging the humanness of another, I am violating my own God self. Probably this message might only be received in a little microcosm. It might be the one thing that starts to wiggle some of the inertia of our self-righteousness and holding on to the grievances and the grudges that we have become so accustomed to. But maybe for some, it might be the thing that begins to spark a flame of recognition that all of this tribalism isn't worth it. That in fact what it's doing is it's slowly degrading and poisoning my essential nature. And if my true aim is to bring integrity to the idea that God is all that there is, There's no better time to start than now. There's never been a better time to let all of this mediocrity of forgetfulness begin to fall away from us so that we can fully bloom and blossom and remember and engage in the brilliance of that which is God. Because there is no other. And I am beginning to do these things for ourselves. So this message is interesting to navigate as more of our language begins to look at things around wounding and trauma and bypassing. All of those things are real in the world of the relative. And so I look at all of this very delicately and very compassionately and go, what then is the proper way? I recall the teachings of Thomas Troward, one of the great earlier metaphysicians in the 19th century. And he said, you can't have the absolute without the relative, and the relative needs the absolute. So it isn't about voiding out one, but it's finding the way in which you bring that hybrid together. And so if I am experiencing life in a relative form, but what I am is the absolute. And part of the big mistake in the relative form is constantly bearing false witness. Other people and myself. Until I get shaken up by that, then I will live in a perpetual self-fulfilling prophecy of my relativeness. I will continue to live out my neuroses. I will continue to live out the wounding. I will continue to live out the cultural misappropriation. I will begin to live out the continuative narrative of the tribalism about who and what I am. I will continue to live out the inhumanity of all of that until I become so uncomfortable with the loyalty of my relativeness that I must move in it because there's just no other way. I must begin to set down all of that melodrama that I may move more into the fulfillment of my absolute nature. And that doesn't matter with regards to what gender I am, what color I am, what culture I am from. It's not bypassing the ancestral lineage of that. It's taking that ancestral lineage and elevating it to a place of restored wholeness. And so can I do both? It's interesting because if I'm looking at that solely as the truth, then according to Goldsmith, I'm bearing false witness. And so as I begin to look at what is it? What is it? Do I live in this realm of the absolute because I've created this intention that I want to see that God is all that there is? And yet, how do I engage with humanity and the relative nature of humanity in a way that's compassionate? There, my friend, is the dance. There is the way of understanding that if you and I are going to be the voice, the consciousness, the awareness of truth, the commitment to bringing the absolute into the relative must be a resilient and beautiful commitment. It doesn't void out the relative. So if someone comes to me in their woundedness, if somebody comes to me because their culture has been attacked, we listen. We listen. We love. We nurture. But we must hone in on the skill of being able to listen, to nurture, and be compassionate, not at the same level of the wounding, but from the level of the absolute. Just as if we would imagine that which is the ultimate expression of love, the absolute love, the intelligent source, God, loves us, can only see and view us as whole, complete, and perfect. It's mighty work. And so this stuff then becomes something that is very personalized. Like I can talk to you about the whole concept of bearing false witness, and we can all come into agreement that let's not do that anymore. But it doesn't mean anything until in the silence of our own practice, we begin to see the enormity of how much false witness bearing we are engaged in. And we begin to, one by one, unleash ourselves from that and to practice the person that we have the grievance with. And we begin to practice the long-standing grudge. And we begin to practice releasing and dissolving the identity of our culture as being something this and something that, less than this emanation and illumination of God. We begin to practice for ourselves, not from a place of proselytizing, but from a place of living it so much that it becomes influential vibratorially when we are around people, because we no longer see them. So it isn't so much then that we preach at, it's that we live it to the best of our agreement. We live it to the best of our practice. We live it to the best of our choice in word, thought, and deed. And that's the way in which we move as one organism back into greater states of peace. And so even this thing, the gathering, even being a teacher, is paradoxical, because here I am talking at you about something that I feel is rich and vital and important, but it won't mean anything until perhaps a small percentage of someone who listens takes it upon themselves to lean more into their absolute nature, to begin to cease the thought crimes of others within their mind and begin to practice the idea. Goldsmith says that the only way to avoid bearing false witness against our neighbor is to realize that the Christ is our neighbor, that our neighbor is a spiritual being, a child of God, just as we are. And so again, to bear false witness is reciprocal. That as I do it to another, I am doing it to myself. And so today's lesson is to consider, how can we become so uncomfortable with the accepted normalcy of bearing false witness? I had to make you uncomfortable, otherwise you would have never moved. And look at the genius of that. Look at the way in which the caterpillar becomes the butterfly. Look at the way in which the oak must be moved and shaken out of the acorn. You and I must become more uncomfortable with the forgetfulness of the practice of being relative, so that more of the absolute can shine. I know that is going to land in the right and appropriate people that it needs to land with. May it be you. May you find a way then to begin to see the godness of all. And so it is. God bless.